Okay, so last we left off, Solon had taken it upon himself to permanently fix Athens with political reform, a vast improvement to the legal system, and a brand new economy. The results were mixed, however. Solon's constitution had been designed to act as a compromise between the rich and poor, with the rich keeping their wealth and maintaining their total dominance over the most influential magistracies in government, and the poor, on the other hand, had political agency opened up to them for the first time, while the systems of debt that had forced them into literal slavery had been abolished. A great deal of the poorest residents of Attica weren't happy with this, calling for land redistribution and a total overthrow of the established order. A lot of the political power that had been opened up to them was bordering on meaningless. The poorest class, the thetes, could attend the ecclesia and debate and discuss the running of the city. Anything discussed there had to first be approved by the boule, an institution open only to the top three legal classes. On top of this, the most powerful political and legal institution in Attica still seemed to be the Council of Areopagus, which was only open to the top two classes, and realistically only the richest citizens. One would assume that in contrast to the very poor, the very rich would be over the moon with how much they'd gotten away with. After all, they'd avoided revolution, with most of their power and all of their wealth intact. Well, not so. Because despite the rising political violence of the late 7th century, just before Solon enacted his reforms, the aristocrats were for the most part having a great time. They could act how they pleased, with their money making them literally above the law. But now that same legal system that they'd been exploiting for generations was now limiting their options for increased wealth. On top of that, they had lost the key to the sense of security that allowed them to act the way that they had done. A total monopoly on the political system. It's also important to note that their money was not the only reason that these guys believed they were entitled to all the power in Athens. It was their blood. In their minds, they owned land and ruled over the other 99% of the population, not just because of their immense wealth, but because they could all trace their families back to the old kings and heroes of Attica. Some even claimed to be descendants of Theseus himself. The Greeks believed that personal traits were inherited through genes, so having hero ancestors was an important part of an aristocratic legacy. Their superiority, proven by the deeds of their long-dead relatives, was not in question. This was the reason they called themselves the best and the beautiful, or the best people. It was more than just blind arrogance. It was a testament to their belief that blood, more than wealth, made them inherently better than people in the rest of society. This was an easy worldview to maintain over the last few centuries, as the economy of Athens had been almost entirely agricultural, and to be fair, still mostly was. The nobles owned all of the best land and would therefore always be the wealthiest class in society. But Solon had dragged Athens into the growing world of Greek trade and mercantilism. He invited other Greeks and foreigners to Athens to come and kickstart some new industries in manufacturing, art and commerce. His new political system did not differentiate between old and new wealth, and a successful tradesman could qualify for the top magistracies and political positions, regardless of whether his parents were wealthy or not. Fearing that the poor had tasted political power for the first time and that new wealth wouldn't have the moral resolve to stop them from taking everything, the nobles were far from content. What happened after Solon left Athens in 594 BCE is unclear. Aristotle says that the peace between the people of Attica lasted for 4 years until 590, and then violence breaks out. Probably because of this, the Athenians failed to elect any archons for that year, leading to it being called the Anarchy. How creative. The next year, things briefly return to normal and stay that way until 585, when another anarchy takes place. This is closely followed by a badly documented 2-year-long dictatorship. A fellow called Damasius, who we know literally nothing about, holds the archonship for an unconstitutional 2 years, before needing to be removed by force. To cut a long and not very interesting story short, Athens was an unpleasant place to live in the 2 decades following Solon's reforms, culminating in a war against Megara over the rights to shipping lanes around this bit here. The war is long and draining for Athens, but by 595 BCE, the Megarians have managed to blockade all the shipping going to and from Athens. This is where the real downside of the reduction in wheat production in Attica becomes clear. More land was being dedicated to olive oil production instead of grain, and the food had become reliant on foreign imports and suffered a food shortage as a result of this. Enter Peisistratos. This is Peisistratos. He's a friend of Solon's, and like his older buddy, he's also going to make a name for himself in a war against Megara. We don't know exactly how he did it, but Peisistratos was responsible for orchestrating a coup of some kind in Megara, destabilizing the state long enough to force them to sue for peace. And so the grain shipments resumed, and Athenian control of the waterways was secured. Peisistratos returned home a hero. Peisistratos actually represented one of 3 main political parties at the time. His party, styled the Men of the Hills, were the poorest and largest of the factions in Attica. They were the class that had failed to break into any of the new industries and remained farmers instead. Because their calls for land redistribution had been denied, they occupied the hilly and mountainous lands not yet gobbled up by the super estates of the wealthy. Here they made a pretty meagre living. They believed Solon's reforms had not gone far enough. His main rival was a man called Lycurgus. He represented the men of the plains, called this because they comprised of the old aristocracy, who owned the large farming estates on the plains of Attica. Their purpose was to reverse Solon's reforms and return Athens to being an oligarchy. Between these two was a third party, the men of the coast. They were comprised of new money, the traders who had become more wealthy and numerous because of Solon's reforms. It also contained the majority of the political exiles Solon had given immunity to and allowed to return home. One of these exiles was their leader, Megacles, from the cursed Alcmeonid clan. Because they benefited the most from it, this party was the most loyal to the Solonic constitution. Add on top of this a weird law of Solon's that seemed to encourage factionalism, the paradoxical decree stating that anyone who failed to pick a side during civil strife could face potential disenfranchisement. Like seriously, even Solon's biographer Plutarch, who is a big fan of his, is confused by this law that seems to seriously contradict the rest of the man's purpose, but whatever. These divisions more or less guaranteed more political violence once the war with Megara was concluded. But Peisistratos had a plan. If he could succeed where all others had failed, and unite Attica under his personal rule, he could prevent the violence and enforce Solon's constitution himself. Of course, he'd need to become sole tyrant of Athens, a task that none had before him had ever achieved and always resulted in bloodshed. But he was a smart guy, so let's believe in him for now. Peisistratos had a plan. One afternoon in 561 BCE, he appeared bloodied and wounded in the streets of Athens. He claimed that his political rivals had attacked and attempted to kill him, but that he'd made his escape. He requested that he be allowed to go about the city with a large, armed personal bodyguard. Believing this story, and taking into account that he was a war hero anyway, Peisistratos got his wish. Little did they know that he had staged the whole thing. Peisistratos had faked the attack, and all of his wounds were self-inflicted. As soon as he was allowed in the city with his armed guard, he took them to the Acropolis and occupied it. Unlike Chilon, who had done the same thing 70 years earlier, Peisistratos was successful, and actually managed to establish himself as tyrant of the city. Apparently he uses this power to do absolutely nothing. For the next year he makes no changes to the constitution, governs wisely and prudently, and doesn't piss anyone off. This was an attempt by him to be like, oh look, I'm a good tyrant that doesn't confiscate your property or purge you or whatever. But it didn't work. Although Peisistratos ruled with a light touch, his rivals were still not keen to see him take power at all. Megacles and Lycurgus team up to boot Peisistratos out of Athens. But after only a year, the man finds himself exiled and disgraced. However, pretty much as soon as he leaves Attica, he gets a letter from Megacles. Megacles, if you recall, was a fan of the Solonic constitution, and wanted to keep it. As a result, he found himself in a difficult situation. The two remaining parties were his and Lycurgus's, the latter of which wanted to return to an old oligarchic government. Whilst losing the battle against the aristocrats, the second aspect of Megacles' identity starts to take over. He's an Alcmeonid, which makes him genetically 20 times more ambitious than your average human being. Olympic athletes, world rulers, people with 8 doctorates and a pilot's license, none of these individuals have even a fraction of the drive to get to the top, possessed by one member of this psychotic family. Realizing that if he helped Peisistratos return and become tyrant, then the man would be in his debt, Megacles forms a plan. So the letter he sends to Peisistratos comes with an offer of marriage between the tyrant and Megacles' daughter, if he'll return and take power. But Peisistratos knows he can't just go back to Athens. He doesn't want to be dictator by force, ruling over Athens with only Megacles' muscle keeping him there. He wanted the people of Athens to genuinely believe his rule was for the best and to support him. And what's the one tool that every ruler, from the Caesars to medieval kings and even politics today, still use? The whole God loves me and wants me to be here thing. So he finds a woman called Fire, who's 6 foot tall and especially good looking, and he dresses her up as Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. Puts her in a chariot, surrounds her with heralds and musicians, and then brings her with him on his return trip to the city. He then has the heralds declare that Athena herself has escorted Peisistratos home, and deposits him on the Acropolis. Herodotus writes that some of the Athenians were so awestruck that they started screaming prayers at the poor woman, who just this morning had just been hanging around being tall on her farm in rural Attica, but now was being screamed at as a goddess. Herodotus himself finds this story very frustrating. He says of the deception that it was by far the most simple-minded one I've ever come across, given that the Greeks had long been distinguished from non-Greeks by being more clever and less gullible. Bit of old-fashioned Greek racism for you there, but if any of you are under the impression that these are the same Greeks who'll have such a huge impact on theatre and philosophy and science, we're just not quite there yet, you know? He even gets salty later on for this because it's the Athenians that Peisistratos tricks, who have a reputation for being especially clever, and they actually fall for this. So Peisistratos was tyrant again, with Megacles at his right-hand side, and all he had to do was marry Megacles' daughter and have a long, happy, incident-free marriage. Here we go. So Peisistratos was not exactly over the moon about having to marry this guy's daughter. To start with, he already had 2 adult sons that he planned to leave everything to, and Megacles was clearly angling that Peisistratos would have children with his daughter, who would one day grow up to inherit their father's power, thus bringing the Alcmeonid clan a step closer to their true objective of world domination. The trouble was, not only did Peisistratos not want to disinherit his existing sons, but the Alcmeonids were technically under a curse. Perhaps the whole Athena personally endorsing Peisistratos thing didn't fully reveal this, but the ancient Greeks were a supremely superstitious people. Things like eternal curses were taken seriously, even hundreds of years after they were placed. Peisistratos genuinely did not want any offspring that he believed would be cursed. So he went about ensuring that he never had children with his new wife. The ancient sources say that he did this by having sex with her in an abnormal way. Decide for yourself what that means. His wife eventually tells her mother about this, who, in return, tells Megacles, and he is fuming at the slight. So angry, in fact, is he, that he abandons his alliance with Peisistratos and opens up talks with Lycurgus and the old nobility again. This is enough to convince Peisistratos to get out of Athens. He and his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, flee to Eritrea. Distraught, Peisistratos sits down with his sons to discuss what they should do next. Perhaps they should take their vast fortune and set themselves up in Thrace. After all, the Athenian people will never peacefully accept the return of this unsuccessful tyrant. Hippias then argues that there has always been another route to power. Peisistratos' rule so far had been based on the good faith of the people of Athens and his political opponents. But what if he returned and took power by force? Then it wouldn't matter how the aristocrats allied for or against him, as they'd all be dead or exiled. The people's opinion of his regime would not matter if he was backed up by the sword. The carrot had failed, so why not try the stick? Peisistratos agreed, but it would take careful planning and preparation. But he would return at the head of his army and take Athens by violence. But I'm saving that for next time for the sake of keeping this video short. See you then.